A few years ago was my 20-year high school reunion. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky. Less than 100 kids in my graduating class, so we all knew each other. Everyone called me Liz. My full name is Larissa Ames, but only one boy in my whole town ever used it. Mitchell Porter. God, I loved that kid. It was a little strange for sure. His family was off somehow. His dad owned all the gas stations in town, and we were all a little scared of him. He was known to be harsh and controlling. Mitchell would come to school often with bruises on his arms and his face, and we all knew better than to ask questions. But he was so kind. He'd listen anytime I needed him to. And I'd like to say I was special, but he made everyone feel like that. Anyway, in high school he was already working nights at a couple of his family's gas stations, so he was rooted there for good. I took off for college less than a month after graduating and promptly lost touch with everyone. My parents even moved away shortly after I did, so there was really no one to keep me updated on the happenings of the town. When I got the invite for the reunion, I was truly excited. I was going through a divorce, and my sense of self had taken quite a hit. Getting back to the grassroots that raised me sounded like exactly what I needed. I just didn't realize at the time that there was someone else, or something else, that needed me, too. My hometown is in a valley. To get there, you have to drive up over the hills surrounding it first. And let me tell you, looking down over that ridge was like an out-of-body experience. It actually stopped me in my tracks, right there in the middle of the road. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "Okay, Liz, you're safe here. It's time to leave it all behind and get back to being you." It really was like stepping back in time. All the colors were a little more muted, a little dirtier, more sun-faded, but every building was in the exact place it was supposed to be. Well, except for one. I squinted into the sunlight to try to make out the one building on the horizon that I didn't recognize. It looked like a gas station, but I couldn't figure out why it would be there. It was just far enough outside of town to confuse me. If I knew one thing about this place, it was that the people in town tended to stay in town. Still, I needed a bathroom break and the sun was going down. I pulled up half expecting it to be shut down, but the open sign was blinking. So I parked and went in. Couldn't see a cashier, but I found the restroom sign easily. I came back out and there still wasn't a soul in sight. Then I realized I was shivering. That was strange. Kentucky summers don't cool off even after the sun goes down. I suddenly felt uneasy and walked quickly towards the door. I went to push on the handle, but
Larissa?
it was the softest voice, but it startled me so bad I missed the handle entirely and ran face first straight into the glass. I hadn't seen anyone in the store, and I hadn't expected to hear that name, not in this town. I turned to my left, and there he was. Mitchell Porter! I laughed and screamed and looked him up and down, the first familiar face in a long time. He'd definitely grown. Still lanky, but not quite the toothpick I'd known in high school. His hair was ruffled and his clothes were filthy, but the familiarity of his face made me comfortable. He dove right in, asking all the right questions. I told him about my new life in Cincinnati, how I'd had the perfect job, I'd met the perfect guy. Then he ended up not being so perfect, and about how I was having to start all over again. I cried a little, and he hugged me. It was nice. Then I started to pull away, and he held on a little tighter. I laughed a little nervously and scolded him gently. "Come on, Mitchell, you can let go. I'm all right." He let go, but he looked piercingly into my eyes.
I could help you, Larissa. You could come home. I've got a place here.
It caught me totally off guard. I certainly hadn't had feelings like that for Mitchell, well, ever. We were closer than some, but I hadn't ever thought much of it. Suddenly I realized I hadn't seen a single other car the entire time we'd been talking, so I checked my phone. It was 4 a.m. I laughed again to break the tension. "You've been a great friend, Mitch. I've got to get going, but I'll see you at the reunion tomorrow, huh?"
Oh, yeah. Sure, Larissa. Sure.
I backed away and headed for my hotel, a little chilled from the interaction. He had seemed so cold at the end. It was a side of him I didn't know and didn't really care to. I was honestly relieved that the next time I'd see him would be in a crowd. I slept all the next morning, didn't wake up until 1 p.m. I got ready and was going to grab some lunch before heading to the school, so I opened the door to my room at about 2:30. I swung it open and gasped, jumping back. "Mitchell!" He was leaning on my doorframe, just waiting. "Mitchell, God, you scared me half to death. What are you doing here?" His eyes were dark.
I had to see you again, Larissa. I don't think you get it. I have a place. You'd be safe. We could take care of each other. It's just behind the turn of the river, back behind the big rocks that we jump off as kids. We can go. Right now. Just come with me.
Mitchell, I don't even know you that well. We grew up together, that's it. I liked talking to you last night, but I'm not going anywhere with you. Let's just meet back up at the reunion, okay? He grabbed my arm.
I want to show you my place, Larissa.
I backed up and screamed. His hand was so cold. I think my reaction scared him, and I almost think he scared himself. He let go and looked down at his hands, confused. Then he looked sad, and he just turned around and left. I was so shaken I had completely lost my appetite. I skipped lunch and just sat in the hotel lobby trying to regain my composure. Finally, it was time to head, so I jumped in my car and went down to the school. It was fun seeing so many familiar faces, and I got pretty caught up in catching up with everyone. Just occasionally lifted my eyes to search for Mitch. Finally, my old BFF Megan, who now worked dispatch here in town, asked me who I was looking for. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I downplayed it quite a bit. Oh, I ran into Mitchell Porter when I came in yesterday. Told him I'd meet up with him here, so I've just been keeping an eye out. She looked down.
That's not funny, Liz. I know you've been gone, but no one here wants to hear that name, even as a joke.
I'm sorry? I wasn't joking. Was he not invited?
You really don't know?
She said it almost in a whisper. Megan, I spent all night catching up with him and he didn't say anything about anything. Tell me what happened. She looked stunned and talked so quietly now that I had to lean all the way in to hear her.
Liz, Mitchell is gone. 5 years after we graduated, his dad got really sick and couldn't physically keep up with work anymore. Mitch had to take over the gas station business. He went crazy trying to keep his old man happy doing it. It broke him. One night, the McKeans next door heard 6 gunshots. Mitch had killed every single person in his family. They found a note on the kitchen counter that said he was sorry, but that he just couldn't take it anymore, and that he'd take care of himself next. But no one has ever been able to find him or his body anywhere. That was 14 years ago, Liz, and no one has talked about that family since.
I know where he is, I told her. Megan called our friend Russ, the head deputy in town, over. I told them where to look. Just beyond the turn in the river, back behind the big rocks that we jump off of as kids. They searched the area the next morning and quickly found the bones of a man. And dental records confirmed it was him, Mitchell Porter. I don't know why Mitchell came to me. I don't know if it was more for me or more for him. Part of me wishes he hadn't, and part of me is glad I was able to give my little hometown some closure. Still, I was done. I drove out for good the next morning and was surprised as I reached the top of the hill and looked back. The gas station I had been in only the day before, it was gone. My name is Sydney. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, and when I say small, I mean it. My family drives 2.5 hours both ways once a year to shop for school clothes at the nearest mall. Most of our parents work in agriculture, and there just isn't much for teenagers to do. There is an old abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town, and even though all of our parents had rules against it, daring to spend a night inside was kind of a rite of passage. As soon as you learned to drive, it was your turn to pick a friend and go. Always on the weekends, always after dark. When I finally got my license, I was stoked. I'd heard stories from the older kids, mostly about ghost noises and shadowy figures. All things that could easily be explained by decades-old hinges and wind blowing through broken glass and hyped-up, over-anxious adolescent minds. I pride myself on being a realist and pretty mature for my age, so I would roll my eyes and tell them that they were such babies. I was not at all prepared for what I was about to live through. The weekend rolled around, and my friend Mel, who was a year older than me, agreed to go. She told her parents that she was sleeping at my house, and I told mine I was sleeping at hers. Classic, right? We started driving around 9 p.m., moving slowly down the unlit dirt road. It started drizzling, and what should have been a 30-minute drive took over an hour. My dad's old truck grumbled over every rock I hit, and I remember me and Mel were laughing so hard, imagining ourselves trying to explain away all the mud that we were kicking up. Finally, at about 10, the outline of the hospital appeared. The nerves kicked in a little for sure. Even a skeptic like me found the circumstances a little unnerving. It was a full moon, but the cloud coverage made it hard to see anything. The rain started coming down harder and the road was slippery as we pulled into the lot. It was just one big building, a huge open lobby front and center with 2 wings off of each side, angled away from us. Mel had come last year and told me there was a courtyard in the back. I was nervous about the road as the rain came down, so I checked my phone. No service, of course. Mel and I climbed out of the truck and realized there was actually another car off to our left that we could barely see. I was hoping it was as abandoned as the hospital. It looked pretty old and beat up. But Mel said she didn't remember it being there when she came last year. That made me even more nervous, but we kept going anyways. We got to the front doors, which were hanging off of rusted hinges and super heavy, cast iron or something. We had to use all of our strength to slide one side of them open just enough to squeeze through. God, I wish we hadn't. The second we were in, we heard voices. We were frozen in the lobby, which was littered with old broken equipment and piles of concrete chunks that had crumbled off of the walls and the ceilings. The corridors to both sides were too long and dark to see down, but for the most part they looked empty, aside from the occasional stretcher. The left side of the building is where the voices were echoing down. Mel grabbed at my arm and whispered in my ear, "We should just leave." But the second she opened her mouth, the voices stopped. The silence was even more deafening. Suddenly there was a huge crash behind us. The hinges had given out on the door we had used to get in and was now jammed against the other one. There was no going out that way. We looked at each other nauseated. I didn't even want to do this anymore, not if someone else was there. And we had heard voices, hadn't we? There was no sound now. I stood silent, trying so hard to make out footsteps or whispers, a car, anything. There was nothing. The wind started blowing and I finally heard what I had been expecting to hear. Those ghost noises coming from broken windows, and in this case, it was straight up comforting. The thunder rolled outside and I gained my composure enough to laugh and lighten the mood. I was sure we had just psyched ourselves out. Mel nervously giggled along with me and we started down the right wing. My eyes dashed around the courtyard out the windows to our left. A few shadows moved and I pointed to show Mel, but they stopped, and we assumed it was just the clouds shifting the moonlight. So we turned around to the doors behind us, the hospital rooms themselves. The first door was closed and we were happy to leave it that way. The second was cracked open, so I peeked in. I held up my phone light and could just barely make out some writing on the wall. I could hear Mel breathing behind me as I stepped inside. "Watch your back" was written in red spray paint on every wall in that room. I just chuckled and whispered over my shoulder, "So corny, right?" There was no response, so I turned and realized I was alone. I stepped quickly back into the hallway and jerked my head in both directions. But Mel was gone. "Mel," I whispered into the dark. Nothing. "Mel, I swear to God, if this is a joke..." Complete silence. I was scanning the darkness as quickly as I could, completely disoriented now. Mel seemed more nervous than I was that night. I couldn't see her sneaking off on her own. Lightning flashed outside, drawing my attention, and then I saw it. 3 hooded figures. I couldn't make out more than that. I wanted to find Mel, and I wanted to get out of there now. "Mel!" I screamed with a renewed sense of urgency. I sprinted down the hallway, knowing I wouldn't be able to move the lobby doors we'd come in at. It felt like forever. I was just running in silence, looking for any semblance of an exit when I heard it. "Sydney!" A whisper. Was that Mel? If it was, she sounded possessed. "Mel?" I said. "Stop messing around, Mel!" I yelled into the darkness, turning in circles, just praying this was a sick joke. "Sydney!" That same voice. Where was it coming from? Then I saw it, a hole in the wall where the cement blocks had wasted away, but it led to the courtyard. I didn't want to go that way. I crouched down and tried to stay mostly hidden as I took a second to readjust my eyes and peer outside. Just then, lightning flashed again, and the 3 figures lit up right in front of my face. I screamed and bolted down the hallway. I could hear scrambling behind me, and I knew they were trying to come in through the hole in the wall. I had little chance of outrunning them once they were in. Just then I heard it again. "Sydney!" To my right was a stretcher, and a hand reached out from underneath. I started to scream, but the voice shushed me. It was Mel. "Help me," she whispered. And I reached to grab her hand and pull her up, and I was stunned when I saw there was blood dripping from her shoulder. "What happened?" I shouted, grabbing her face in my hands, but her eyes were glazed over. She wouldn't make eye contact. If she wasn't possessed, she was definitely in shock. I threw her arm around my shoulder and dashed across the hallway to the nearest room as 3 sets of footsteps grew louder in our direction. We had to hide. I tried so hard to shut the door quietly, but the decades-old building betrayed me, and the door wailed. They would know exactly where we were. I helped Mel sit down on the floor and threw a cart from the corner of the room under the handle right as the footsteps reached the door. It was quiet. Then the handle shook. The cart was just tall enough to stop the door from unlatching. I ran to the corner of the room and threw up. There were no windows in this room. We were trapped. I pulled out my phone again. 1 bar. I pulled up my dad's number and desperately hit the call button. Nothing. For 2 terrifying hours, we sat in that little room with no windows. All we could hear was the sound of whoever or whatever was on the other side of that door trying their hardest to get in. Something metallic would scratch at the hinges, and the handle would shake, and they pounded on it rhythmically, chanting something over and over and over again. All we could do was sit and listen. I covered my ears and just rocked. Mel never said a word. Over and over, I dialed my dad. I dialed 911. I sent texts, just praying something would go through on my phone before something did at the door. 2 long hours later, sent as a text message, showed up on the message to my dad. "At the abandoned hospital. In trouble. Help me. I'm so sorry. I love you." Shortly after that, my phone died. I cried and I screamed, and just when I thought I couldn't stand it anymore, the noises stopped. It was quiet for a while, and then, Mel, do you hear that? There are sirens outside." It was the first time she showed any emotion. She snapped awake and cried with me. Pretty soon there was a voice at the door yelling,
"Sydney! It's me! Are you in there?"
and we recognized my dad's voice immediately. I moved the cart and swung open the door and collapsed in his arms. Mel's parents were right behind. Outside, the police asked for the story. I told them what vehicle to look for and where it had been parked, but they were confused. None of them or us had been over there, and the ground was covered in fresh mud. There should have been tracks. There also should have been footprints in the courtyard, but there wasn't. There wasn't a single trace of anyone else being there that night. I never could get Mel to tell me what happened that night for the 15 minutes that I lost her. The hospital said the gash on her shoulder looked more like it was from a blade than broken glass. One of the most traumatizing parts of the whole ordeal for both of us was that a girl from a neighboring town went missing the next weekend. She had just turned 16 and told her friends she was going to the abandoned hospital. She was never seen again. The police didn't find even a footprint out there that night. I don't know who or what is haunting that building, but after graduation, I am moving as far away from this town as I possibly can, and I will not be looking back.